Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, September 11th, 2008. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, home brewer Kai Troester joins us to talk in depth about the concept of attenuation. What is attenuation? What are the factors that affect it? And how can we test the attenuation potential of our wort? If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Well, Kai and I talked for a good long time, so I want to keep my opening comments short this week. I do want to give a quick update on the French Press Pale Ale that we made the other day. This past weekend, I infused a couple of quarts of wort made from extract with 2 ounces of Willamette pellets using the French press. First, steeping the hops for 15 minutes in 1 quart of the wort that had been brought up to boiling, and then boiling those hops in the other half of the wort for 15 more minutes. And I'm hoping that will boost the hoppiness and bitterness of that pale ale. I did the procedure, by the way, live on Ustream, and a handful of Twitter followers got to see that. It was riveting, I'm sure. I'll keep you updated on the progress of that beer. It smelled great coming out of the airlock, by the way. And I discovered that pellets are not as easily handled with the French press as are whole hops. So, there you go. One more quick note. I got an email from John down in Melbourne, Australia. He's with the Melbourne Brewers, and they've got a special event coming up. John says, attached is the poster and press release for the launch of Two Tones Pale Ale on Thursday, September 18th. This beer is the Champion Brewer Prize for our annual Beer Fest competition. The winner, in this case, winners having one of their recipes brewed on a commercial scale. Pretty cool. John says, this is a pretty big deal for our club, and we're just trying to get the word out through various media. Spots at the launch are limited, but perhaps, if you're going to mention this event, you could add that the first 5 people to email twotones at melbournebrewers.org, that's TWOTONES, at melbournebrewers.org. The first 5 people to email that address and mention Basic Brewing Radio can be added to the list. So there you go. If you email TWOTONES at melbournebrewers.org and mention Basic Brewing Radio, you can get in on that launch of the Two Tones Pale Ale. Congratulations to the winners, and good luck to the Melbourne Brewers down there. Also, you can go to melbournebrewers.org for more information on that event. Sounds like a fun time. Okay, as I said, I was going to keep the opening comments short, and there you go, short opening comments. Now, Kai Troester and I have been writing back and forth for quite a while on the topic of attenuation. Kai's been conducting experiments, seeing how different factors affect attenuation in test worts, and it's pretty interesting stuff. And I've been after Kai to come on the show and talk about attenuation in general, and I was happy to get together with him and chat. Well, Kai Troester, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Oh, welcome. Thanks for having me on the show, James.
We've been talking for quite a while. Several months you contacted me, I believe, saying that you were running experiments on attenuation, and I expressed interest at that time to get together with you and talk about the topic because, we like to talk about a range of subjects on Basic Brewing Radio, from, just having fun to the kind of hard scientific stuff. And this, I think, would definitely fit under the hard scientific category. I guess let's start by talking a bit about you. What's your background as far as being a home brewer and what you do in life?
So my background as being a home brewer is, it would be easy to say, I'm German, but it's not necessary that we learn brewing in Germany. It's just, I actually picked up home brewing when I was in America already, and for me it was a way of making something at home that I really enjoy a lot. I was I was also cooking a lot at the time, and I just enjoyed the process of making a basic staple of my diet. And, well, my background, what I do for a living is I'm a computer engineer, and I design microprocessors, and that puts me in front of a computer all day. So when I come home, I like to have something that is more hands-on.
And you apply, with some people, we were talking before that some people can say that brewing is an art, but there's definitely a science background to it as well. And I guess that your technical knowledge and your approach to your work can also affect how you brew as well.
Yes, I take very much this scientific approach, and probably it comes from being an engineer. I just like to know how things work. Just having a black box and turning a few knobs there and just hoping that I get the right outcome, that does not really give me much enjoyment. I like to know how the inner things work and what could I do to make the outcome even better.
And that gets into a bit of what you do. You're doing both in the mash tun and the fermenter. You're doing some experiments in controlling the fermentability of the wort. And part of that is looking at our topic for the day, which is attenuation. What is attenuation for those who think they know what it is, or for those who have completely no clue what it is? How can you describe what attenuation is?
Well, yes, we call attenuation the percentage of extracts, actually mainly sugars, that are fermented during the brewing process in comparison to what was there before. So if you have an attenuation of 80%, that means 80% of the sugars have been 80% of the sugars that were there before have been fermented and have been turned into alcohol and CO2. But we will talk later that it's actually not 80%. It's actually less, and that has to do with the factor of alcohol itself.
And how do you measure attenuation?
Attenuation is measured by taking the starting extract and the finishing extract of it, or most brewers call it the starting gravity and the finishing gravity. And you subtract the finishing gravity from the starting gravity and divide that by the starting gravity, and then multiply with 100%, and the resulting number is your attenuation. There's a difference between what's the apparent attenuation and what's the real attenuation. And for simplicity's sake, when brewers talk about attenuation, they always mean apparent attenuation, because that is what you calculate from hydrometer readings. And while the original gravity reading is not skewed by alcohol in the wort or beer, the finishing gravity is skewed by alcohol, because alcohol is lighter than water, so it makes the liquid to appear less dense than it actually is. And so we get what we call the apparent final gravity, or some in the literature is often called apparent extract. And there's also what's called the real attenuation, and that actually means like how many or what's the percentage of sugars that have actually been fermented without the result having or being skewed by the alcohol falsifying the readings. And to actually get the real attenuation from the apparent attenuation, there's a very simple formula that can be used, and that is that the real attenuation is 82% of the apparent attenuation. So you just multiply apparent attenuation with 0.82, and the resulting value is your real attenuation. So if you have, for instance, a beer that has a real apparent attenuation of 80%, that is a real attenuation of about 66%, I believe. So that means 66% of the original extract, mainly sugars, have been fermented and 34% are still in the beer.
Huh.
Which is actually a surprisingly large number of what is in there. It's just a little over half that has been fermented.
Yeah, that is surprising.
And that's also where a lot of the calories are coming from, and that's why like brewers who make these low-calorie beers, they are interested in making a very highly fermentable wort to get that real attenuation as high as possible, meaning that as much of the carbohydrates have been fermented.
And as brewers, why do we care, or why should we care about measuring or controlling attenuation?
Well, attenuation is one of these properties of beer that one can easily measure with a hydrometer. And it tells a lot about that beer. Basically, it tells how much of the original extract has been fermented, so how much residual extract is present in the beer. And different beer styles, they have their optimum at different levels of attenuation. And attenuation is oftentimes correlated to sweetness and dryness of the beer, although there's not that strong of a correlation, but it is close enough to say that a beer that is less attenuated will be sweeter than a beer that is more attenuated. But it depends on many factors as well.
And say it can help you understand if you were making a barley wine, say, with a very high starting gravity, and you wind up with an ending gravity that seems high to you. You can understand if you measure the apparent attenuation, you can actually find out that you have a good attenuation rate, even though the finishing gravity is high, because you started off with such a high gravity.
Right, and that has to do with the fact that if you start out with a lot, then you get a lot of fermentables, but also a lot of unfermentables. So at the end, the unfermentables will keep the final gravity high, but you started out with a lot, and that results also in a lot of unfermentables.
So that can kind of shape your expectations of your beer when you're kind of designing a recipe. So let's talk about, you were talking about extract, but we're not talking about the extract that you buy in a can or a bag, a dried or liquid extract. We're talking about what you get in the mash tun, right?
Right. It's basically, extract means the sum of the fermentable sugars, the unfermentable sugars, the other carbohydrates, and then also smaller constituents like proteins and minerals and all that. But that is a very small amount. The majority of the extract is made up by carbohydrates.
And what you do in the mash tun can really shape the amount of extract that you get from the mash.
What you do in the mash is you basically have your set of enzymes, and they get to work on the starch and from the malt, and they will convert that into soluble substances, and as a result of the balance between these enzymes, there will be a different balance of the various sugars that will end up in the wort. So if you favor one enzyme, for instance, if you favor the beta amylase in your mash, then the mash will produce more maltose as opposed to unfermentable sugars. So your fermentability of that wort will be higher than if you would have emphasized the alpha amylase, which is not so good at producing fermentable sugars, even though it is able to do that. So there are many factors that you can actually play with in the mash that affect the attenuation. What they do, they affect the fermentability of the wort, and later on the yeast performance will then, in addition to that, will also affect your attenuation.
So what are the factors? We got temperature is one.
Yes, the main factor, if you're talking about a single infusion mash, is the temperature, and that's what brewers generally control. Other factors are, for instance, the mash schedule that you choose. If you choose a step mash, then generally that results in higher fermentability because you will dough in at lower temperatures, and at that temperatures, the enzymes can already hydrate and can get ready, and are not shocked into their work as they are when you mash in at higher temperatures. And also the length of the mash has an effect. So the longer you let the enzymes work, the more they can produce, and the different enzymes have different optima for different mash durations.
And also the water to grist ratio, the amount of water that you have in there, as opposed to the amount of grain as well.
Okay, yes, that's another important factor. Actually, there is a lower limit that you can have on the mash. Actually, it's an upper limit that you can have on how thick the mash can actually be, because the enzymes need water to work, and if there is too little water available, then they don't work as efficiently. In contrast to that, if the mash is too thin, then the enzymes and the substrate, which is the starch, are spread out too much, and they just don't bump into each other often enough to work efficiently.
That's an interesting comparison. If the wort is or if the mash is too dilute, then the working parts can't get together.
Right, but that applies to really thin mash. That we're talking about maybe 3 quarts to a pound already, which is just not practical for brewing in average gravity beer.
Also, what grains that you use determines your ability to ferment those sugars, or to create those sugars to be fermented.
Yes, and that comes back to what enzymes are available. Like if you use a lower kiln malt like Pilsen malt, then there are many, many more enzymes available eventually in the mash than if you would use a dark or a highly kilned malt like Munich malt. And as a result, Munich malt mashes, if done at the same temperature as a Pilsner malt mash, would result in a lower fermentable wort. And that's also historically is the reason also why like a Munich Dunkel is less well attenuated than, for instance, a Helles.
There's so many variables. That's why I think brewing, especially whole grain brewing, is so fun.
Right. Yes, there are as many variables as there are only a few that are really practical for the brewer to play with. And when it comes to single infusion mashing, then the mash temperature is the best knob that a brewer can turn on. But he or she should keep in mind that there are many other variables, and it's best that those are just kept constant, right? That you keep the water to grist ratio constant. You know that you can't necessarily take the same mash temperature that you would use for a Munich Helles and expect to get the same attenuation level when brewing, say, a double bock, where you would use a lot of dark malts. So these things should be kept in mind when trying to tweak the fermentability of the wort through mashing.
Where does the mash pH come into the equation?
Well, the enzymes, as much as they are sensitive to temperature in their activity, they're also sensitive to pH in their activity. And both alpha and beta amylase, they have an activity optimum that is in the mid-5 pH range when actually the sample is measured at room temperature. So there's some, I wouldn't say confusion, but you have to keep in mind that as a mash is heated up, the pH of that liquid actually changes. So if you would measure the mash pH at mash temperatures, you would find that it is about 0.3 points lower as compared to the same mash sample cooled to room temperature.
So for the same reason that you want to calibrate your hydrometer to temperature, you would want to calibrate your measuring of your pH.
Yes, and so given that, you have to then also see if you see someone mentioning a optimal mash pH, then you have to always ask, well, is this the mash pH at mash temperature, or is it the mash pH that you measured when you cooled the sample to room temperature? Because most pH meters and strips are designed to actually measure samples that are cooled to room temperature. Actually, as far as I have learned from reading some literature, that the automatic temperature adjustment of a pH meter doesn't correct for changes of the mash pH based on temperature. It actually corrects of changes in the probe sensitivity to temperature. So that because the change in pH is actually dependent on the substrate itself. So if you would take another liquid and you would compare the difference between mash temperature pH and room temperature pH, it is not necessarily 0.3 pH points, and that's why it's difficult for pH meters to actually do that adjustment.
So extract brewers have less control over the variables, but they still have some points where they can affect the potential attenuation of their beers, right?
Yes, they have, and actually they can do it much more controlled than an organ brewer can, because if you know the fermentability of the extracts that you have available, then you can assume that those fermentabilities pretty much stay the same between each batch of extract, because the brewery that they come from, they are very consistent in their mashing. They are much more consistent than you can really be at home. And because of that, you could, for instance, take the approach of blending a highly fermentable extract with a highly unfermentable extract, and depending on where you put that blend, what ratio you use, you could adjust from the fermentability of the extract. But that's a level of involvement in extract brewing that probably most extract brewers won't really go to, and they just rather go to all grain brewing, where your level of control is greater, essentially. But in addition to that, you can use specialty malts to control the fermentability, not only for extract brewing, but also for all grain brewing, because malts like crystal malt and roasted malts, those are generally completely unfermentable sugars. So if you add that to the mash, the enzymes will not break that down, and you will get that as unfermentables into the wort, thus lowering the fermentability of the wort.
And adding a bit of body, essentially, to your beer. And an extract brewer can also add unfermentable sugars in the form of, say, powders, malted dextrin and lactose and such as that as well.
That can be done by the extract brewer and the all grain brewer. There are beer styles that do basically require for instance, the addition of lactose to sweeten the beer, and there's a sugar that is not fermentable by yeast, but it's sweet, which is lactose.
So is there you talk about in your writing, and I'll put a link to your webpage in the description of this episode, but you talk about a fast ferment test. Is this a way that before fermentation you can test your wort and kind of get some expectations of what you're going to get?
Right. It's something that happens not necessarily before fermentation, but it happens in parallel. Well, the idea of the fast fermenters is that you take a sample of your wort and you only actually need enough to fill a hydrometer once. So I generally take about 4 to 5 ounces, so I have a little bit to spare. And I then pitch that with compared to that volume, a very large amount of yeast. And in general, what I would do, I would just take some of the yeast that is left over in the starter vessel once I pitch the yeast into the main fermentation batch. And you take that sample and you keep it in a warm place, you shake it occasionally, and you want that yeast to go all the way. You want that yeast to ferment all the fermentable sugars that are actually present in that wort. And because you're doing that warm and because you're doing that with a very large amount of yeast, you will get very close to that what's called the limit of attenuation. And that's basically the yeast would not be able to go further because it lacks enzymes to metabolize other sugars that are present in the wort, and those other sugars are the unfermentable sugars.
So the limit of attenuation is if the yeast had all the opportunity to eat everything it possibly could, that's what the limit of attenuation is.
Yes, that is, and that is something that is only affected by processes in the brew house, right? Like how do you mash? What adjuncts are you adding in the kettle? And that determines the fermentability of the wort. And with that test, you can actually test how fermentable that wort is, and you don't have to rely on having a perfect fermentation for the main batch, because this fast ferment test is done not for beer quality at all. It is just done for seeing where is the limit, how well did I do in matching to actually get to my desired target for fermentability.
I would imagine a stir plate would be helpful for doing this fast fermentation test.
Yes, if you have a stir plate to spare during that time, you can put it on there. I generally then start thinking about, I don't want to introduce too much oxygen into that because I actually want that yeast to ferment and produce the alcohol necessary, because you have to get the same level of alcohol, otherwise your apparent attenuation will not be the same, because if you have less alcohol in that beer, then it will not show itself as light as the regular beer in terms of gravity. But I'm not sure if this is really a concern. I just have put a fermentation lock on the flask if I put it on a still plate. But oftentimes I just take a clean jar. I don't even have to sanitize the vessel that I do that in, because the amount of yeast is so large and the time that it actually takes to ferment is so short that any other bug that could ferment additional sugars doesn't really get a chance to do so.
And what time period are we talking about?
Talking about 3 to 4 days. So generally, even the ales, it finishes before the fermentation, the main fermentation is done. And the interesting aspect is actually that I have been testing this test for a while recently, and I also got the idea of, like, why don't I just use bread yeast? Because I just have it in the fridge and generally in large amounts for pitching. So I have been doing that fast fermentation test with bread yeast in parallel to the actual yeast that has been used in that batch. And it comes close. It's depending on the beer, it may be dead on. Sometimes it's maybe a point or so higher, but not really far off. So if you just if you don't have any yeast to spare, just try the bread yeast. You won't be that far off. I just want to say that the attenuation experiment that you alluded to in the beginning, that I've been doing, all of those have actually been done with bread yeast just because it's cheap and readily available.
Yeah, if you're doing experiments over and over and over again, liquid yeast especially gets pretty expensive.
Yes, right. So just also want to talk about the idea of the limit of attenuation again. Like once you have this number, this is not the number that you're actually shooting for in attenuation. It now depends on the beer style, how many residual fermentable sugars are actually still desired in the beer. And that is a concept that I found in a German brewing textbook, and it kind of really showed me, oh yeah, it is actually that there is another thing that I could control in my brewing process, and that's not just controlling the attenuation of the beer. Now, what I can also control is the difference between the limit of attenuation, basically the difference between the fermentability and the attenuation that is actually achieved during the fermentation. And I want to just say some numbers, and this only relates to German beers. I'm not sure, I don't have numbers like that for other styles of beers, but for instance, for a Helles, you want to have that 2 to 4% difference. It means that if you have a limit of attenuation of about maybe 80%, then the final attenuation of the beer should be 82 to 84%. And that gives it the right balance of residual sugars left in the beer. For an export, which is known to be drier, and because it's an export, it was highly attenuated, and there you want to have a difference between, let's say, 0.5 to 2%, and for double box it can be up to 6%, because those have more residual sweetness in them.
Yeah, you don't want your fermentation to be so efficient that it just strips away all the character from your beer. Right,
and now that this concept or the idea of the limit of attenuation exists and is measured, one can now look at that and say, oh, I have a beer that didn't attenuate so well, but actually my limit of attenuation from the fast fermenters was exactly where I expected it to be. That tells you that next time around you don't change anything in the mash, you have to change something in fermentation.
Oh, that's a good point. If you do your test with your fast ferment and everything goes right, then you know it's not the mash, it's got to be in the fermenter.
Exactly. So you wouldn't dial down your mash temperatures when actually your problem was underpitching or insufficient aeration. And that already gets us to the point of, well, how is attenuation controlled in the fermenter?
That's interesting. Now, talk to us about, you started to talk about some of the variables in the fermenter, but let's go over all of the things that we can control while the beer is fermenting, while the yeast is working.
Right. So the biggest, one of the big factors there is, what yeast are you choosing? And there's also the difference between lager and ale. So there is a genetic difference between lager and ale yeast. So lager yeast can completely ferment raffinose and maltotriose, and ale cannot ferment the raffinose, and only a third of the maltotriose. But that is not really a difference that actually matters to brewing so much, because raffinose is absent in brewing world, and as far as I gathered so far, maltotriose is only present in very small amounts. But what seems to matter between lager and ale is that the lager is much better at fermenting. Did I say maltotriose actually meant that the sugar that lagers can ferment is maltobiose. But coming back to the maltotriose, those sugars can actually be fermented by ale and lager, but lagers are much more efficient at doing it, and ales are more prone to get stuck halfway through their fermentation of the maltotriose. So that's why lagers generally tend to go further than ales in main fermentations where you have a proper pitching rate.
So the yeast strain that you choose, whether it's lager versus ale, but also there's subsets within those that there's a list as long as your arm of all the different types of yeast that you can choose.
Those differences, just how does the yeast behave? And if you look at fermentation, what is actually the one key aspect is that yeast does not like to be in alcohol and it doesn't like to be in CO2. These are byproducts of the yeast metabolism, and it actually would like them to be removed completely. And the higher those levels get, in particular the alcohol, if it gets above 5%, then the yeast has to do an uphill battle against the alcohol level. So, and if there is not enough yeast there to begin with, or if the yeast health is suboptimal, then it is likely that it just loses that battle before it gets to the point of attenuation that you actually wanted it to go to.
So pitching enough healthy yeast is critical.
It's critical to drive the attenuation closer to this limit of attenuation. And generally, you want to be fairly close to that limit because that removes this cloying sweetness from a beer. There's a lot of homebrewers take the attenuation numbers that are given by the major yeast companies like White Labs and Wise. I think they are taking them way too serious because all this. I mean, the problem is, and I actually did contact Wise for that, is that there is no standard wort or standard fermentation practice to actually measure these attenuation numbers. So you don't really know what was the limit of attenuation or the fermentability of the wort that they were determined with. You don't know at what temperature they fermented, what pitching rate was used. And as a result of that, it's difficult actually to use these numbers to accurately predict your final gravity, because there are too many variables in there that you don't know how they actually affect that.
So that's one more reason to do maybe a fast ferment test with a particular yeast strain.
Yes, and the good thing is if you have this limit of attenuation, and if you know where the yeast will stop, you can actually do things like bottle, even if the fermentation is not totally done, as long as you have not too much sugar left in the beer. And I'm doing that actually for my Weiss beer a lot, where I know where the yeast will stop after doing this test, and once the fermentation is close enough to that value, I say, okay, now I can just bottle the beer, and I may add a little more sugar to compensate for to make sure that this sugar and the residual fermentable sugars in the beer that will be enough to carbonate the beer. And as a result of that, I can bottle after, say, a week, and a week later it's carbonated, and so after 2 weeks it's ready to drink.
Wow.
It works well for a Weiss beer, just because those beers don't have a problem with a lot of yeast being still being suspended in the beer. So I just want to come to another factor that is basically something that is special for each yeast. It's just the characteristic of flocculation, where some yeasts will earlier start to flocculate. It means they will just clump together and either rise to the top or fall to the bottom. And once they do that, they don't really actively ferment the sugars anymore. So the earlier they flocculate, the more residual sugars they will leave behind. And that's why low flocculating yeast, like a German, like a Kölsch yeast or an Alt yeast, they will produce better attenuated beers than, let's say, an English ale that just flocculates very quickly and then forms dense clumps.
Yeah, that was kind of counterintuitive to me, I guess, because I thought if the yeast got out of the way, if it flocculated well, then that would increase the attenuation, because then they wouldn't be in the solution. But if they're not in the solution, if they're not floating around in there, they're not working. They're lying down on the bottom.
Right. I mean, if yeast is the yeast, I'm not sure if something that is actually in suspension, like the yeast is, will affect the specific gravity or the of the actual liquid. Because you said that if they were still in suspension, then the attenuation would be worse.
Yeah, that was my thinking, that if they were in the solution, if they were floating around, then they would contribute to the gravity of the beer. But I don't know that that's necessarily true.
No, I don't. I'm not sure about that. I've been thinking about that recently. When it comes to the question, well, do I have to wait for my troop to settle in a hydrometer sample? So I don't have a real answer for that.
Now, along with the temperature in the mash tun, temperature in the fermenter is also extremely important.
Yeah, that just yeast like it warm, and lager and ale. Brewers just don't like them to work at warm temperatures, so we have to strike a compromise between them having it warm enough to do a good job, but not too warm so that they get too excited and produce too many off flavors. And so that means, like, that's why if you have attenuation problems and the yeast slows down, oftentimes toward the end of fermentation, you could just let the temperature rise a little, in addition to maybe agitating the yeast, trying to get it into suspension again. But the process of flocculation is generally controlled by the amount of nutrients that the yeast still has in the wort. So if you really get it into suspension again, unfortunately, they will flocculate again they will flocculate quickly thereafter again, just because you didn't really fix the problem why they flocculated, which was, there was not enough to live off anymore.
Putting them back into the hostile environment is not necessarily going to wake them up.
But oftentimes that does help somewhat. I know from brewers who have fixed poorly attenuated beers or fermentation that slow down by just giving the carboy or rousing the yeast in the carboy and getting more of the yeast in contact with the wort, and that's the idea actually behind the yeast not having flocculated. They're all still in contact with the wort, and that's also why Anheuser-Busch does their special beechwood aging, which sounds all fancy, but it just means that they have something where they where they expose much more yeast surface area to the wort, as opposed to the yeast just laying on the flat floor in the fermenter.
Now, one other variable is not necessarily controllable in ale fermentation, but time. The fermentation time is also a factor.
Yes, the longer the beer is in contact with the yeast, the more the yeast can work on that beer, given that it's still active, and that can be utilized in lager fermentations, where towards the end the fermentation slows down, and if you could then say, okay, I want to hit a certain attenuation based on the limit of attenuation that I measured earlier, and you could say, well, once it hits that limit, that desired attenuation, I'll just take the beer off the yeast. But you have to make sure that at that point, diacetyl and other young beer constituents have been sufficiently removed, because the yeast would be needed to clean them up as well. This is a level of control that I don't think many brewers will go to. I I see it in my lagering that I can get maybe half a point or so, half a gravity point over a few weeks, and that's also the time, like when the beer starts to get close to that attenuation that I determined from the fast ferment test and style of beer, then I feel that the beer starts actually tasting the way I want it to taste. The sweetness has subsided, but it's not too dry yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just another means for the scientifically oriented brewer who doesn't want to rely so much on his palate actually to see when it's pointed, but he wants to have some confirmation also through measurements to say, oh yeah, that makes sense now, so I can rack the beer into a serving keg and off the yeast.
Now, so in your opinion, in all your research, what do you think for the practical home brewer, what do you think are the most important factors to look at when you're talking about controlling attenuation and getting the proper attenuation for certain beer styles?
Right. And first of all, to control the fermentability of the produced wort, just get a mash schedule that works for that beer and vary, say, the saccharification rest temperature up and down to control the fermentability. And that's basically your main knob that you would play with. In addition to the mash time, you can also play with that, extend or make it shorter.
What is the water to grist ratio that you would recommend for most typical beers?
I would say it's more style dependent. Beers that come more from the English background, those are traditionally mashed with fairly thick mashes, where you would have your 1 1/4 quart per pound. If you talk about German style beers, those generally are mashed very thin, and you go up to 2, maybe a little more quarts per pound, and those mashes are thinner because traditionally the German mashes have been stirred and they have been pumped, and also for the concoctions you needed to have a fairly thin mash. So that's where that is coming from. And also, if you have more mash water, or if you have a thinner mash, then that also means that you have more water in the mash, and you don't use as much sparge water.
Mm-hmm.
And if you use less water to sparge, then you will extract less of the undesirable compounds from the husks during sparging. So that's actually why a beer, if you want to make a delicate beer, then you should mash that fairly thin, so in the range of 2 to maybe 2.25 quarts per pound.
And what about on the fermentation side? What are the factors that you think are the most important in controlling attenuation?
Right. If you want to control that attenuation, basically if you want to control the difference between the limit of attenuation and the actual attenuation, you would do that with the yeast strain. If you make sure that the pitching rate is appropriate, that the wort has been aerated sufficiently and the yeast is healthy, then the yeast characteristics, its flocculation characteristics, its characteristics towards alcohol, its ability to ferment malt or trios, for instance, how fast, those characteristics will then get you to the right difference. But you just have to make sure that all the other factors are optimal, because it becomes difficult to troubleshoot, well, what factor exactly was off if you don't get to the desired attenuation.
Well, Kai, this has been fun, and I look forward to the next time when we can talk more about your experiments.
Well, thank you.
Well, thanks again to Kai. I'll post a link to his site in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. And I would look forward to Kai coming back on to talk about his experiments on attenuation when he gets those completed. Well, if you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on the site, you can check out our low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD, where you can see Steve Wilkes do a single-step decoction mash, and you can follow me through a lager fermentation in the middle of summer where I don't use a dedicated chest freezer. There are also our original DVDs in Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We walk you through the extract brewing process, step by step, from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. We got combo deals on the site to save you a couple of bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. And importantly, you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us online at basicbrewingshop.com. We've got shirts of several different colors now. We appreciate everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Murder, She Wrote, the complete 4th season, and Scroll Black Retro Splat Mat, which apparently is what you put under the high chair to keep all the splatterings from the high chair from getting on the floor. Wish we had one of those. That sounds really handy. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what from that site, from that link, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.